Okay, so good evening everyone and welcome to the evidence base for game-based assessment in recruitment. This presentation, by its very nature, is one that is presenting a state of the market and the research base at the present time, but will probably be outdated within a few months. But what it is aimed at giving you is a really fresh, up-to-the-minute view about the research that is publicly available around game-based assessments, and hopefully give you some insight, if you're not already using them, about whether they might be right for you. During the webinar, there is the option to ask questions. You might see that you've got a little box marked questions on your screen, so do tap in questions there, and I'll be checking the box as we go through to check to see if there's any that we can answer as we run through. So just a quick word as to who I am. So I am a chartered psychologist. I'm managing director of a company called STEN10. What we do is we design bespoke psychometric and behavioural assessments. We design assessment centres, personality questionnaires, ability tests, etc. We don't publish our own game-based assessments. This is an area of intrinsic interest for me, so it's something that I've researched independently. And it's it's something that, I guess, not being a publisher of these tests myself, I'm in a position to give a fairly objective, independent view of them. I'm a board member of the Association for Business Psychology, so in that capacity I'm always interested in hearing what the latest developments are in assessment, and therefore this tied in very well with my interest in that area. And I was an avid gamer until the advent of fatherhood meant that all of my spare time was spent looking after my wonderful children. But it's still there, burning at the core. I'm an avid gamer. Okay. What you'll see now is a demonstration of why perhaps I have not developed my own game-based assessments. Look at that, isn't that amazing? Let's go, in the words of Mario. I can almost hear the groans over the microphone now. So let's run through the agenda for this evening's session, which will last probably around 45 minutes or so. I'd like to start by talking about what are the key parameters of a game-based assessment. Now, I'll do a little poll in a minute just to get a feel in the room for how much experience you have, but I've often found when I talk about game-based assessments, a little refresher about what they are is useful. Also, no matter how much you can describe what these games look like, there's no substitute for actually seeing them. So I've got a few screenshots that have been available on publishers' websites and also from academic journals, just so that you can place yourself in that world and imagine what these assessments look like. Once I've introduced what they are, we're going to review the evidence base, and I'm going to talk you through different types of evidence. There are types of evidence that would be seen as, I guess, absolute gold standard, and that would be independent, peer-reviewed academic research, where the researcher had no particular commercial agenda or any other type of agenda. So that's one type of evidence. We then have a large body of evidence from the creators of these assessments themselves. Now, they've been doing some absolutely outstanding work in investigating these tests and seeing whether they come up to the standards of traditional psychometric tests and maybe even exceed them in some instances. So that research done by the publishers would be categorized separately. I guess being a realist is that there will often be some kind of commercial imperative behind wanting to do that research and wanting to talk about the results, but that doesn't make the results of it any less valid. But I guess there's just that perhaps that critical eye that should be cast over it. And then you've got the expert opinion of people who've been working in the area of psychometrics and psychological assessment for decades, and they've posited some quite interesting questions that we should consider, and they're probably avenues for further research, but they've not necessarily actually had that research conducted as of yet. So I'll talk you through that. Then we're going to run through some classics of how you go about assessing how good a psychometric test is. So we'll talk about reliability, validity, adverse impact. So does one group perform better than another group in an unfair manner around a protected characteristic, for example. And we'll also talk about engagement. So to what extent does it engage candidates and encourage them to move on to the next step? I think that in my discussions around this subject, a lot of people aren't just using the traditional means of judging a test's worth when they're looking at game-based assessments. Often it's also part of a PR or branding exercise, and therefore social media reach, user acceptability, and maybe their intention to accept a job at the end of it are very valuable metrics to measure. So we'll talk about those as well. We'll end up with some conclusions, but I'll also ask you for your views as well on where you seem more or less convinced by the evidence that we're presenting. Let's do a quick poll just to see the level of experience in the room. First of all, I'd be interested to know who has actually played a game-based assessment before. So let's just wait for the votes to come in. Okay, we'll close that down. And you can see that 63% of you have actually played a game-based assessment before, so that the majority of you have. So a fairly sophisticated audience here, which is great. Next question, who is already using game-based assessments? Either their company offers them or they have bought them in from a provider. Then you might fall into the third category, which is I don't yet, but I've got some plans to, and I need to have my mind made up either way before I do so. Okay, as most of you voted there, let's have a little look. Okay, so actually the majority of you aren't using game-based assessments currently. A quarter have some plans to, and 13% say yes. So that's interesting. So whilst the majority of you have some experience, the majority haven't yet integrated that into your selection processes fully. Okay, great. Let's move on. So we'll start by giving an introduction to game-based assessment and talk about some of the key parameters that underlie them. The first distinction to make is gamification versus game-based assessment. So any of you that have been to one of the major game-based assessment publishers' talks recently will have had this distinction made clear. So gamification refers to the process of turning any kind of assessment into something that has game-like characteristics. So for example, rewards for doing well, or a leaderboard, or challenges to overcome. Now that could be in the form of a computer game, or it could be something entirely different. It could be something that actually takes place within an assessment center, for example. One of my favorite examples of gamification in recruitment comes from a piece of work that was done for GCHQ. I believe it was by TMP, and as part of the attraction campaign, candidates were asked to solve a code. If they solved the code, then they were awarded the website link at which they could actually apply for the job. Candidates weren't tracked by name, so their performance wasn't measured, but this was intended as part SIFT, because it did require some level of aptitude to get there, but also part PR and branding exercise and engagement exercise. And indeed, a lot of the benefits of this particular piece of work were talked about in terms of social media shares and the number of people talking about it. So that's gamification. A game-based assessment that we're talking about here is something which actually is a computer game. So something that is completable via either a mobile phone, a tablet, or via a PC that actually looks and feels like your traditional computer game. There are 4 different types that we're going to talk about today. Those are pre-existing games. So what I mean by that are games that were not developed for the purposes of assessing people. They were developed for the purposes of entertainment. So something like Grand Theft Auto or World of Warcraft. These are games that have been developed for the purposes of having fun primarily, But some researchers have used these to say, well, can we look at the data gained from gameplay to say this predicts something about people's personality or people's motivators or people's abilities? The second type are custom design games. So these are games that are built from the ground up with the express purpose of measuring a psychological characteristic. So much more narrow in scope, tend to be far simpler in terms of their design and their visuals, and they tend to be developed with psychometric properties in mind from the very beginning. The third type is gamified traditional. So I'm going to show you an example a little bit later on of an SJT that's had a gamification wrapper put on it. But this is where we take a test that traditionally would be presented in a fairly standard, maybe perhaps unengaging manner, and find ways of making people engage with it and be more motivated and enjoy playing it. And the fourth section is VR or virtual reality based assessments. So these are those where you wear a headset and you are immersed in a completely new virtual world that you need to navigate and perform certain tasks in. The people that are working in this area are sometimes hesitant to actually call these games. They say that these are more aligned to realistic experiences or augmented reality in a way. But I've put them in here for ease of labeling in this presentation. What do these game-based assessments measure? Well, I mean, I've listed some up here. So sometimes they're looking at your ability, so they're tests of maximum performance, your cognitive processing speed, your attention span, working memory, as well as your good old verbal, numerical, and abstract reasoning. Sometimes they're looking at personality traits like your persistence, your propensity to take risks, or even your emotional intelligence. And the outputs tend to be scores. So these scores tend to be comprised of direct behavioral data. So for example, if you're looking at something like persistence, did they persist at a task? As well as metadata. And metadata are things that we're capturing during the game. For example, number of mouse presses or degree of mouse wiggle before choosing an option that feed into an algorithm that can predict behavior, although we're not necessarily sure why it predicts behavior. So we might not be sure why pressing the mouse button twice to ensure that a command has been entered might predict a certain personality trait, but it does. So that's the output. I think one of the things you'll see from the start is that under the abilities banner, verbal, numerical, abstract reasoning are traits that are very commonly measured within the psychometric arena. Things like working memory, attention span, cognitive processing speed are perhaps less common. You certainly seldom see that kind of language in a job description. So I think that flags for me one of the early things to bear in mind when you're choosing a game-based assessment is, can you show the relevance of the abilities that you wish to measure? And therefore some kind of validity study done in-house before you begin would be a great idea if the data doesn't exist already. Okay, let's show you some examples. So the custom game-based assessment marketplace. I have put some key players up here. This is by no means all. These are those that are very public and sharing their data with the community, and also include some that have been kind enough to speak with me directly. So I guess I would just like to say thank you to those that did give me access to their research, and well, no one refused me, but those that I approached via their website, again, I guess it's just respect to them for making it publicly available. I think one of the things I've put in brackets around here are the years in which the companies were formed. Now, I guess the overriding tendency of these companies are quite new, and these organisations tend to be leading the research in the area of game-based assessment, and therefore it's not unreasonable to find that things like predictive validation evidence, so do these games predict performance in 5 years' time, are a little bit lighter on the ground than they might be otherwise. And that's because the people at the vanguard of research in this area are themselves fairly new to the area. So That's just something to point out. So let's bring some of these to life rather than names on the page. Here are some examples of screenshots. So I said that it can be helpful just to help visualize what these custom games look like. Here's 3 different games from Arctic Shores, measuring things like your numerical reasoning skills, as you can see there. We've got some example screenshots from a company called Rebellion, Theme Park Hero, and also some games that are a little bit more of the, I guess, traditional psychological test format, which you can see around the bottom and to the right. Pymetrics, another test publisher, and again, fairly kind of straightforward interface, simple, clean, and the images are fairly straightforward and easy to perceive. Knack, here's some screenshots from their games. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got an example of a game that's a little bit like Angry Birds, where you're firing a balloon, I believe, that's exploding on various people. Over on the left-hand side, that game, I think it's called Wasabi Waiter, and you have a task to serve food to customers, and you can see that they have certain mood states, and you need to interpret those mood states and serve them accordingly. There's a couple of other firms out there that have perhaps slightly less of a I guess, light-hearted game-based feel. So a company called Cognidev seeks to measure an array of psychological characteristics, including memory, analysis, transformation, metacognition, etc. And a company called Lensa also has a nice game where you need to build these abstract shapes in order to reach a goal. So, so you can see there's quite a bit of visual variation in how these games are presented. But essentially, they all fall under the custom-built banner. These are all been built from the ground up to measure these characteristics. Just to show you the kind of pre-made games that have been used in research in this area, I've got a couple of screenshots here. Over on the left, we have Neverwinter Nights, which I did play back in my teenage years, hours whiled away in the bedroom, talking to orcs and the like. And over on the right, World of Warcraft. There's a fantastic screen grab at the bottom there, based around a game called Battlefield 3, I think, where a researcher looked at the correlations between personality questionnaire statements, such as "I love children," and in-game behavior, like kills per second, hits per second, headshots per second. And you can see that these are negative correlations. So what that means is that I guess the less you agree with "I love children," the more headshots per second you're likely to be gaining in this game, Battlefield 3. So some interesting conclusions can be drawn there. The third category, tailored traditional games. Here's an example called Chat Assess from Qt. It's essentially a situational judgment test, but it's presented in the form of a WhatsApp-style chat. So people are presented with charts and data, and they're asked to answer questions, but they do so via a chat interface. So it's, I don't know whether you'd call it a game, but you'd call it something that's been got a wrapper around it that makes it feel more fun and engaging. And then the fourth category, I've put virtual worlds and virtual reality in there. So there are games where you can roam a virtual simulation, and you can interact with the environment in quite I guess a formal type setting. But there's also ones where you go full headset and you need to navigate your own world. And I was at CAP a couple of weeks ago trying out their virtual reality simulator, which was fascinating. So really interesting stuff. Right, so that's given you an induction into what game-based assessment is and brought the different games to life. The next question is, what is the evidence base behind them? Let's just remind you of those categories. So, green ticks, peer-reviewed research published in an academic journal. Blue ticks, research and case studies from test designers or user organizations. Black ticks, opinions and hypotheses from experts. So I'll remind you of these as we go through. The first thing we're going to talk about is reliability and validity. So reliability you can think of as, I guess there's a number of different types of reliability, but primarily it's around how consistently does the test measure the construct that it says it measures. Does it tend to get the same results time and time again? Does it actually tend to get the same results within constructs within the test itself? Validity, on the other hand, is does it predict what it intends to predict? So is there actually, is it an accurate predictor of performance? So let's talk about reliability. We're going to talk about three different types: consistency over time, internal consistency, as well as sources of measurement error. So consistency over time just means if you take the game today and you take the game tomorrow, maybe at a different time of day, or feeling more stressed, or feeling tired, or even having a bit of a practice at the test, are you likely to get different results? Internal consistency says, well, each time we've said we measure a construct like numerical reasoning within a game, do the items tend to, or do the questions tend to relate to one another? So you do well at one question, you tend to do well at the other questions that are supposed to measure that trait or construct. And finally, sources of measurement error are things that could reduce the fidelity of the conclusions that you reach. So things that could throw you off path in your measurement of your psychological constructs. So let's take a look at some of the data. Now, this has been anonymized, so I'm not going to be talking about which test publisher this came from, but they've kindly shared with me some of their data here. So if we look at internal consistency, then I've got a couple of studies from different manuals, one which placed this in the region of 0.67 to 0.87, depending upon what scale was being measured. That was done with around 150 people. And a second test publisher had internal consistencies of between 0.51 and 0.96. What does that mean, I hear you cry? Or maybe I don't hear all of you cry that, but some of you might be crying that. The benchmark when you're looking at ability for internal consistency is 0.7 or higher. So for things like verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning, abstract reasoning, 0.7 or higher is really what you want to see. For things like personality constructs, then we tend to accept slightly lower internal consistencies. So that means that the items, the questions within the scales are measuring a broader array of ideas, so that the personality scale is richer. We tend to accept about maybe 0.6 to 0.9. That would be ideal. We don't want it any higher than 0.9 in personality, because you then start double counting. You're essentially asking the same question again and again. So what do we think about internal consistency? Well, I mean, you can see that at its lowest end, it's perhaps not quite coming up to scratch, but for the vast majority, they're falling within a decent range. These are small sample sizes, though, so we're talking 100 people, 150 people. There may be other studies that have been done in-house, but they're not generally released to the public at the moment. So I guess it would be a cautious optimism around this, but more research is required. Consistency over time is the second one. Again, we're looking at about 0.7 or higher here. We want people to be as similar as possible if they were to take it over time. And if we look again in a test publisher's manual, then the individual scales range between 0.57 and 0.82. Remember, 0.7 and above is the benchmark. So again, it's slightly mixed, so some scales less good than others. And I guess what is not clear at the moment is what's happening to make those scores change over time. There is some evidence to suggest that in a virtual reality environment, practice effects have a big impact on performance. So you really need to get used to wearing that headset and navigating the virtual world before your improvement really starts to improve. However, with game-based assessments, so handheld games, the custom ones that we're talking about here, there's less evidence to say that's the issue. But it could be reflecting some of that, a bit of a practice effect, or it could be that it's more affected by outside influence, so people interrupting you, noise or time of day, etc. The third type is called parallel form consistency, and this is, I guess, uniquely important for game-based assessments where a company is using it as a PR exercise. So there's now quite an array of game-based assessments to choose from, but still some firms say, actually, we would like it branded up to reflect our colours. We might want a little animated character that's from our organisation. Can you add that in, please? Now, what that would require, strictly speaking, is a revalidation and a reconsistency analysis of the test before it went live. And there isn't much data on this, but what there is suggests that the parallel form reliability, so essentially are the two tests measuring the same thing once you've tweaked them, ranges between 0.44 and 0.79. So again, 0.7 or higher is really what you're looking for. Then you can start to think about using these interchangeably and generalizing results from one version to another. And this suggests that for some scales you can't do that, but for others they are better. Okay, let me just check the question bar. No questions yet, but do fire them away if they occur to you. Okay, so let's talk about, under the reliability heading, some sources of measurement error. So these are things that could affect how accurate your game-based assessment score is. One is Philippa Riley from, I believe she's still at ANDC, wrote a great article in 2015 for the BPS Assessment and Development Matters that looked at game-based assessment, so dig that out if you haven't got it already. A couple of the hypotheses she had are, well, if people are more engaged in an assessment, does this mean we could have longer assessments? So rather than this race to the bottom that the traditional psychometric providers have had, let's get a shorter test, a shorter test, a shorter test. Actually, if we can test them for 40 minutes and they're not complaining because they're having fun, this might give us more reliable measures. So that's a hypothesis to investigate. The other hypothesis she posed was, if people are more immersed within a game-based assessment, so they almost forget that they're being assessed, could this result in less conscious distortion? That's a great question, and it was actually one that was posited by a researcher called Landers in 2015, and his hypothesis was that it could be more resistant to distortion. This was investigated, so Lara Montefiore in 2016 looked at people's ability to modify their scores in a personality questionnaire to appear more of a people person versus their ability to do so in a game-based assessment, and found they were significantly less able to do so in a game-based assessment. So actually there is some support for this hypothesis that they are more resistant to distortion because people are more immersed. It's less transparent about what you're trying to get at, so it could be a more accurate picture. Okay, other potential sources of error. A couple of researchers, Zapata, Rivera, and Bauer, hypothesized the following sources. So first off is, well, is there a bit of a reliance here on irrelevant factors such as hand-eye coordination? Normally, in traditional psychometric testing, this is not so much of a consideration. I mean, as long as you can click next and select A, B, or C, or D, it's fine. But the ability to navigate a character around a screen or to make very fine motor movements to land something on something else, that could be a new source of error. They also worried that highly interactive and engaging games may create unnecessary cognitive load. I guess it's that unintended consequences facet. So I know this from my work in designing SJTs, situational judgment tests. You're trying to create a little scenario at the start, but if you make that scenario very long, very verbally complex, you start to create a test that's actually quite difficult from a verbal reasoning perspective, and that isn't the intention at all. You're trying to get at someone's preferred way of behaving in a situation. And likewise, the hypothesis here is if you create a very visually complex game with explosions and characters and lots of graphical detail, could that be detracting them from the core of their task? And the final piece of evidence here, practice effects. A couple of researchers found evidence for this in virtual world environments, but again, it's not so well researched for game-based assessments on a screen or a mobile. So, some potential source of measurement error. Most of these are either hypotheses or have been researched only lightly. So if there's any students on the webinar who are looking for a dissertation project, then there's a few for free. The next topic to talk about is validity. So there are three types we're going to talk about. The first is face validity, which is essentially how acceptable is it to candidates that they are measured via this means? Do they see it as a fair assessment? Can they see the link to the job? And I've lumped in engagement in here because I think they're part of the same thing. So do they buy into its use, and are they actually motivated by completing it? The second type of validity is construct. This is essentially, do we know what we're measuring? So when we say that a game-based assessment measures these aspects of personality, does it tie in with what a traditional measure of those aspects of personality would say about someone? And then finally, criterion. So does it predict anything? Can we say that scores on the game-based assessment actually have a correlation with assessment center performance or job performance? Okay, let's have a little look here. Okay. So face validity, an interesting study from KPMG in 2014, that they used a gamified learning tool. And I guess that's a caveat that I return to at the end, but a lot of the research is not only led by the test publishers, but it's also led by game use in a learning or developmental setting, which I think does have a different context for people taking these games, a different mindset. But nevertheless, 80% of people said they enjoyed the gamified learning tool. However, they did find that what they described as hardcore gamers disengaged from the tool. They found that millennials were most likely to log on, but quickest to drop out. Hardcore gamers are those defined as people that I think spent 10 or more hours per day on games. I can't imagine who's got the time to spend 10 or more hours a day on games, and I'm not jealous at all. But I guess part of the hypothesis here is that maybe they've got very high expectations, and I think when you're looking at game-based assessments to use, that may be something to consider. That actually you want to appear trendy, engaging, hip, dare I say, but if the graphics and the interface aren't up to scratch, then actually you're likely to put off people that are possibly the people you're most trying to appeal to. They did find that males are more likely to engage with the game, but as we'll see later under adverse impact, this isn't a universal finding. Technology stability. So a few of these pieces of research come from the PsyOp conference in the USA, so a large conference for business psychology that occurred this year. And Bruce found that in their use of the gamified SJT, 60% of candidates preferred using this over a traditional SJT. So the majority of people did. It's still, I guess, a sizable portion, 40%, would either favour the traditional SJT or say, I'm fine either way, but it is tipped in favour of the gamified. One of the reflections that he made was that if there are any technology difficulties, so if the internet goes down, or if the software isn't, the hardware isn't quick enough to run the game effectively, that does lower candidates' perceptions. So you need to be sure that you've got the wherewithal to run these games smoothly, effectively, and have a seamless experience for them, as you would do with any online assessment, I guess. A piece of research also presented at PsyOp was around whether candidates saw these game-based assessments as fair. So there's a piece of research that Landers talked about game-based assessments being fairer than a general cognitive ability test. I'm not sure which general cognitive ability test that was. I think it's something that actually looks at cognitive abilities in the round rather than a specific test of, let's say, verbal reasoning alone. But they do see game-based assessments as fairer. There was a test publisher's manual that I found as well that said 40% of participants saw it as more fair, 40% of participants saw them as less fair, and 20% of them didn't see it either way. So I guess it's overall, I guess it's positive, but there is a portion of people that are going to be querying their use. And I think one of the key things we'll come on to in a moment is the need to explain your rationale for using game-based assessments and almost selling it into people to overcome these views of skepticism. Okay, how about people's intention to accept a job offer as a measure of engagement? Well, a series of research studies has found that animated characters are more likely to get a positive attitude towards the hiring company and a stronger intention to accept a job offer. So if you're reviewing your game-based assessment and this is one of your intentions, then see if you can find one that actually includes a little character that talks them through the instructions perhaps, or you need to navigate a character, because those seem to be beneficial in that regard. Likewise, around the area of enjoyment, Arctic Shores showed a bit of research that found that 94.3% of participants enjoyed playing a game-based assessment. That's a large sample size, 1,747, so overwhelmingly a positive view. I guess perhaps a slight note of caution is the next research from Ostrom. They found that whether you enjoyed the game-based assessment or not was mediated by what your own personality is like. So those people who are more open to experience in Big Five personality terms, and also more agreeable, so are more likely to, I guess, act in a kind and nurturing way towards others, tended to say that they enjoyed the game more. Now, I guess you could extrapolate from that and say, well, one of the unintended consequences of employing a game-based assessment could be that you start finding that you get a higher proportion of people with these personality traits coming through, because they're the ones that enjoyed the game, stuck with it to the end, and viewed the whole experience as positive. That's a very tentative hypothesis, but it's something to maybe be mindful of, and to make sure that, I guess, people that aren't of that personality type are catered for somewhere in your selection process. Okay. Back to an expert hypothesis. So Ben Hawkes suggests that game-based assessments are more likely to attract recent school leavers, early job candidates, and recent graduates. I mean, that is a hypothesis. I think that where I've seen it used a lot, especially I guess in the UK, is part of intern, apprentice, and graduate recruitment. I think a lot of the early tranche of games did have a more cartoony style. However, some of the more recent ones are intended to appeal to a more either senior audience or just more a sober and serious audience, so the more abstract games or the ones that are set within a more of an office environment. A really interesting point here, though, was some research done by Laumer et al. In 2012, and they found that, yeah, although candidates enjoyed a game-based assessment, they value fairness, ease of use and usefulness of the assessment more than enjoyment. So they need to know that these assessments are fair, they should be easy to use, they shouldn't be faced with glitches or lengthy sign-in processes, and the outputs, the feedback they get, should be useful, and those are all more important than having fun. I guess if you went to a party and you knew that every action was being judged and rated and would determine your future career, it might be less fun. So bear that in mind as well when you're choosing these assessments. Don't over-egg the fun part. Okay, construct validity. So this is what is being measured by the game-based assessment and how that's been investigated. So I think we've talked about this already. Identifiable constructs like working memory, processing speed, etc. Of course, there are some very well-established measures of that in the academic world. And also lots of metadata that can feed into an algorithmic assessment. Some of this data can feed into identifiable constructs, so you might find that your score on processing speed is not just how long you took to complete a task, but you might find that some of those things around your click speed and your location, etc., feed into that. But some of them are actually used as predictors in their own right. Okay, so correlations with established measures of the same construct. So looking in a couple of test providers' manuals, then these correlations range between 0.24 and 0.44, depending upon the sub scale that was being measured for one publisher, and 0.2 and 0.26. How good is that? Well, for validity, I guess for construct validity in particular, if you were to say we're thinking of using this interchangeably with our old measure of working memory, or whatever it might be, then you'd be looking for a pretty high correlation. You'd be looking for a correlation of about 0.7 or higher. If you're just saying, well, look, would it broadly predict someone's score in this area, then you'd probably be going more down the criterion validity level, which is about 0.3. You're looking for maybe 0.25. So I guess that's not hugely impressive. So I guess what would the learning be? I guess it would be that what game-based assessments are measuring are I guess not direct interchangeable measures of things that are measured by other tools elsewhere. They're measuring perhaps something else or something additional. So don't just swap them in and out. Do they measure the big five? The big five personality traits, which is a very well-known and replicated psychological model of personality. The research here has been done with pre-existing games in the most part, and there's a couple of studies here. Neverwinter Nights, the one that I was playing as a teenager in my bedroom, they looked at 275 individual metrics. What that means is, did they, I don't know, tend to fight with a sword, or did they tend to fight with magic? Did they buy the flagon of ale in the tavern, or did they go off and hunt a goblin? Now, they found 1,375 correlations with big five traits. However, some of these could be spurious, could be in a bit of a fishing expedition. Let's just see what correlates with what. You're going to get out some correlations that come out as significant. And also, the sample size was small. There was only 44 people in the sample size. So you would want far more research before you could hang your hat on that. And then a complementary piece of research looked at World of Warcraft and found no link. I mean, they did find a consistent support for preference for virtual teamwork and technology readiness. So gameplay within these games did predict something, but it wasn't personality in the big five sense. Now, I'm not sure how I pronounce this, but Baniqued et al. 2013 found that working memory was measured well between game-based assessments and traditional measures of these measures. So that was strong in terms of working memory. And this was a really interesting study presented at SIOP. I know it's early days, so this is not necessarily the full picture, and it's something which I know more research is planned, but it was a piece of research done by Lochner et al. And it was I guess it was a partnership between Arctic Shores, that's the game-based assessment company, and Qt, which has more traditional psychometric tests. And what they were looking for was to see, well, does performance on our game-based assessment predict performance on these traditional assessments? Here is a summary of the results. Now, I won't expect you to read that and absorb that immediately, but just as a broad pointer, those correlations that they thought would emerge, and did, between the game-based assessment and the traditional ones are shown in green. So those are good, strong things. We predicted it, it happened. However, you'll also see some other color shadings there. So those correlations that they did predict but didn't happen were shown in yellow. So they thought there would be a relationship, but the study showed no, there isn't. And then finally, in grey, those are significant relationships between the game-based assessment and the traditional ones, but they weren't predicted. So there wasn't necessarily a priori hypotheses that this would happen. So again, is that a spurious correlation or not? So I guess the overall conclusion around construct validity is that the evidence here is perhaps slightly less strong, that we actually know that we're measuring constructs that have been measured time and time again in the past. For some aspects, like working memory, it's all right, but for others, it's a bit more mixed. So again, consult with the test publisher and look at the manual if you want to try to say, yes, we're measuring this pre-established construct. Okay, so on the the home stretch now. Let's talk about criterion validity, and then I'll just take a quick look at the questions. So criterion validity, to what extent does a game-based assessment predict a particular criterion or criteria? So Landers in 2017, again at SIOP, aimed to validate a cognitive ability game-based assessment through comparison with the traditional test battery. What he looked at was whether the game predict grade point average, which is your average of your academic scores in the US. And what they found was that it predicted grade point average better than Spearman's G. Spearman's G being a measure of general cognitive ability, a little bit like an IQ test. They've actually found it was better than Spearman's G, so the Spearman's test didn't provide any unique prediction over the game-based assessment. So that's impressive. It is based within an academic world, but it's I know that in this particular case, Landers, who's attached to an academic institution, said to the test publisher, "I'm going to publish these results no matter what, whether they're good or bad." And kudos on the test publisher for saying, "Yep, we'll go with that." And it actually did come out as significant. Other research has been done. Well, there was a bit of research done with air traffic controllers by a different test publisher, and they found a significant difference between successful and unsuccessful applicants' mean scores on the game-based assessment. So essentially, it predicted success at the end of the selection process to a significant degree. And a final piece of research here, prediction of competency scores at an assessment centre for sales jobs range between 0.135 and 0.347 in terms of correlation size. So again, you're ideally looking at 0.3 and above here, but with large enough sample sizes, some of these are going to be significant, and so there is a link here. I have not found any studies that look at the link between game-based assessment and future job performance. So is that person going to be one of the star performers in this particular area in 2 years' time, 3 years' time? Hopefully, I will get a flood of people emailing me afterwards saying, here's a link to all the research that you weren't aware of, but despite my best efforts and despite speaking to a number of the test publishers, I haven't been able to dig that out. And that's because it is so new. So this is, I guess, an encouragement to say that if you are going to use it in your own organization, do some validation first so that you know what it is that you're predicting. Okay, let's take a quick look at the questions. They're a little bit squashed up on my screen here. First question, which is, will you be following this, sharing the slides? I'm going to share a copy of the webinar. Yes, possibly the slides as well. I might just need to go through and correct any typos and things. And then we've got another comment. Good comment from Vince. He suggested that might the differences in ability to fake a personality test be because the folk wisdom on how to fiddle personality test is more widespread? Yeah, I mean, there are a number of test preparation sites typically focused around ability, but they will also give you advice around personality questionnaires as well. And if you're looking at a statement that says, yeah, I prefer to be on my own, and you're applying for a job in a in a very teamwork-oriented environment, it's pretty obvious. But I guess if we've got a head start because the folk wisdom disfavors the traditional approach, then we could take advantage of it. So whilst that folk wisdom doesn't exist for for game-based assessments, then we could take advantage of it. Okay. Okay, so just having a look through the studies there. Yeah, and Mark Abrahams has pointed out that, yeah, guidelines really ask for 0.7 reconstruct validity, and therefore, how do we defend game-based assessments? So, I mean, I guess it depends what question you're trying to defend them against. So, if you're saying, if you're trying to use the assessment as a proxy for a measure of a traditional construct, then yes, that is not compelling evidence. if you're saying, actually, what I'm interested in is its ability to predict success at assessment center, and maybe I'm less interested in the what of what I'm measuring, then I guess that's a different question. But then you do come on to the issue of how do you give feedback? So if you're not 100% sure of the constructs that are being measured, then how do you give them useful feedback that they'll be able to reflect on and work on if they are successful or unsuccessful in the job? But that's a good challenge. Okay, adverse impact, let's look at some of the research here. So case study 1 from 2016, 5,000 participants, no adverse impact found for age, gender, ethnicity, disability after a working memory adjustment for dyslexia, gaming experience, handedness, and screen size. So I think some of these studies show that people are thinking laterally about where you're going to need to look for adverse impact, and some of those things that people, probably the first question on their lips are, well, how do you get some people that don't play games, some people that do? How about the younger generation versus the older generation? And it's coming through pretty positive. The second study there from 2017 was from a different test publisher. They found no adverse impact for age, gender, or race. A third study, again, looked at gender differences, 155 participants, and they didn't find gender differences on the aspects that they were measuring. There was a fourth case study, though, with a far larger number of participants that did show significant differences between all biographical groups. Yeah, not necessarily sufficient to counterweight the other ones, but I would just again say, as with all psychometrics, it's the importance of monitoring adverse impact within your own selection process. So let's talk about some of the conclusions that we can draw from this. So what would I draw from this? I think this quote sums things up quite nicely. The practice of gamification has far outpaced researcher understanding of its processes and methods. There is a lack of academic and non-vendor-led research. Much research comes from game-based learning, which involves assessment, yet different motivators. So the whole context of completing a game-based assessment designed to engage and inform you and educate you is different to one that's designed to assess you. So it's a plea for more research. It's a plea for, I guess, more sharing of studies that have been done by the people that are working in this area, both organisations and publishers. Of the evidence that there is, reliability, so internal consistency, and consistency over time, engagement and adverse impact data look promising. Construct validity and parallel form reliability is variable, and validity on later assessment stages looks reasonable. So does it predict your outcome at assessment center is reasonable, but again, it's vendor-led research, and we need more of it. We need more work / some work on work-based criterion validity, because that just doesn't seem to be out there at the moment. I haven't spoken much about VR and game-based assessments, and again, that's because it's so rare that there really isn't the data out there yet. The publishers that I have spoken to about that do seem to be following a rigorous approach in terms of they're following the British Psychological Society guidelines with regard to test development and reviewing things from an adverse impact perspective. But again, there's a whole host of things that we've never had to consider before as psychologists. So when you're wearing a headset, what happens if you suffer from vertigo? What happens if the power suddenly cuts off and you get a feeling of disorientation? How's that going to affect your test-taking experience? So it's really exciting, it's really innovative, and there's lots of questions to answer, which again would be great research questions for a student. So let's do a final poll. I'd be really interested in hearing from you about where your concerns are. So do you have concerns left? And if so, then please do vote and let me know where those lie, because I think this is something that can allow the test publishers themselves, I can feed this back to them, and this is where they can focus their research on, and hopefully it's also where the academics can focus their research. So the poll's up now. So is it the reliability, so the consistency of these tests over time and their tendency to be affected by external events that is your big issue? Is it validity? So does it do what it says it will do? Does it predict performance? Does it have good face validity? or is it adverse impact, so differentially advantaging one group more than the other? Okay, let's take a look. Got most people voted now. So it's a landslide for validity. So that's where people really have their key question. And I think, I mean, that's in some ways it's not surprising, because essentially that's the most obvious path to being able to prove the value that game-based assessments can bring over normal assessments. So that's yeah, but I didn't necessarily expect that to be that marked. So that's really interesting. Thank you. I think that's the end for now. So let me just close the poll. Thank you very much for your time and attention. If you do have any further questions, comments, feedback, or would like to talk about anything people assessment related, then do drop me an email. And in the meantime, I hope you all have wonderful evenings, and yep, speak to you all soon. Okay, bye everyone.